There are some stories in history, or perhaps in faith, that make us uncomfortable the moment we hear them. Stories we wish were simpler, cleaner, easier to explain. But this is not one of those stories, because this story begins with something deeply unsettling. A father, a son, a mountain, and a knife. His name was Isaac, the promised child, the miracle child, the boy his parents waited decades to have, the son born after impossible hope, the child Abraham had prayed for, protected, loved, the son meant to continue everything, a promise, a future, a legacy. And one morning, everything changed. Because according to one of the most disturbing stories in the Bible, Abraham woke before sunrise and prepared to sacrifice his own son. Think about that for a moment. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. A real mountain, real fear, real fire, real silence, and a father walking beside his son, already knowing something the boy did not. Imagine Isaac for a moment, young, trusting, following his father without suspicion, perhaps sleepy from the early journey, perhaps asking ordinary questions, perhaps believing this was simply another act of worship, another family journey, another ordinary day. How could he know that history would remember this moment forever? How could he know that generations would debate what happened on that mountain? Because for thousands of years, people have asked the same uncomfortable question. What kind of father would do this? Was Abraham faithful or terrifying? Was this the ultimate act of obedience? Something psychologically devastating. And perhaps there is an even harder question hiding underneath it all. What happened to Isaac afterward? Because strangely, many people focus on Abraham, his faith, his sacrifice, his obedience, but few stop to ask about the boy, the son, the child standing beside the altar, the one who saw the knife, the one who heard the silence, the one who almost died. Did Isaac ever feel safe again? Did he trust his father afterward? Did something inside him quietly break on that mountain? Or did this moment shape the rest of his life in ways nobody talks about? Because here is something deeply human we understand today. Childhood experiences matter. Family wounds matter. Fear matters. Trauma echoes, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations. And perhaps that is why Isaac suddenly feels strangely modern, because many people understand what it feels like to inherit something painful. A father's fear, a parent's wound, silence inside a family, love mixed with fear, trust mixed with confusion. And maybe that is what makes Isaac's story so haunting. Because this is not only a story about sacrifice. Perhaps it is a story about what children carry after difficult love. Because love can heal, but love can also confuse, especially when trust becomes frightening. Imagine the walk to the mountain. Father beside son. Wood carried on tired, shoulders, silence between them. And somewhere along the journey, Isaac notices something strange. The fire is there, the wood is there, but the sacrifice, missing. And so the boy asks a question, a heartbreaking question. One sentence that has echoed through centuries. Father, where is the lamb? Imagine Abraham hearing those words, knowing what Isaac does not yet know, feeling the unbearable weight of what comes next. And perhaps that silence felt heavier than the mountain itself, because this story does not feel simple. It feels complicated, painful, human, messy, the kind of story people wrestle with, because easy answers never quite feel enough. Some see this moment as the greatest example of faith ever recorded, a father trusting completely. Others see something darker, a moment too disturbing to ignore, a test nobody should ever face. And psychologists today ask uncomfortable questions too. Could an experience like this leave scars? Could fear reshape trust? Could trauma quietly pass from parent to child? Because perhaps Isaac's story is not ancient at all. Perhaps it still lives quietly inside families today. A father's pain becoming a son's burden. Unspoken fears traveling through generations. Parents loving deeply, while still passing down wounds they never meant to give. And maybe that is what makes Isaac unforgettable, because many people know what it feels like to carry something inherited. Anxiety, fear, emotional distance, silence, expectations impossible to carry, love that felt complicated, and somewhere inside, the quiet question. Was I safe? Was I truly seen? Did my parents know what they passed down to me? Because perhaps the mountain where Isaac almost died never truly disappeared. Perhaps every generation climbs some version of it. A place where trust is tested, fear is inherited, and love becomes complicated. But before we judge Abraham, before we try to understand Isaac, before we ask whether faith healed or wounded this family, we must go back to the boy himself, back to the impossible expectations placed upon him, back to what it meant to grow up as the miracle child of Abraham. Because Isaac's story did not begin on the mountain. It began long before that, with promises, pressure, and the unbearable weight of being the son everyone believed was chosen. Before we can understand Isaac, before we can understand the mountain, the silence, the knife, and the questions that still haunt his story, we must first understand what it meant to be Abraham's son. Because Isaac was not born into an ordinary family. He was born into expectation, into pressure, into a promise far older than himself. And perhaps that alone already carried a burden no child fully understands. To understand Isaac, we must go back to an old man staring into the stars, back to Abraham, a man who had already spent much of his life waiting for something impossible. According to the ancient story, God had promised Abraham descendants as countless as the stars, a nation, a legacy, a future. One enormous problem remained. Abraham had no son. Years passed, then decades. Hope grew painful. The ancient world was brutal in its expectations. Children were not only loved, they were survival, inheritance, protection, future. A son meant continuity. Without children, your name disappeared. Your family line vanished. Everything you built ended with you and Abraham. He waited and waited and waited. Imagine the emotional weight of that. A promise constantly repeated, while reality refused to cooperate. Time passing, hair turning gray, dreams growing quieter. Perhaps some nights Abraham questioned everything. Did I misunderstand? Was the promise ever real? Because delayed hope changes people. Sometimes it strengthens faith. Sometimes it wounds it. Sometimes it creates desperation. And eventually, something extraordinary happened. Against expectation, against age, against biology itself. Sarah became pregnant. The impossible child arrived. Isaac was born. His very name carried meaning. He laughs, because laughter had once filled the room when the promise sounded impossible. Imagine Abraham holding Isaac for the first time, and old man, finally holding the child he thought he might never see. The boy represented everything: hope, legacy, promise, meaning, future. This was no ordinary son. This was the son, the promised child, the miracle child, the one heaven itself had supposedly chosen. And perhaps that is where Isaac's burden quietly began. Because being deeply loved can sometimes become pressure, especially when expectations surround love. Imagine growing up, knowing your existence carries meaning bigger than yourself. Imagine hearing stories constantly. You are special. You were promised. God chose you. At first. That sounds beautiful. But expectations can feel heavy, especially for children. Modern psychology understands something ancient families rarely discussed. Children often absorb invisible emotional weight. Parents pass down hopes, fears, dreams, disappointments, pressure, sometimes without realizing it. And Isaac's family was complicated. Far more complicated than many people realize, because Isaac was not Abraham's first son. Before Isaac, there was Ishmael, born through Hagar, a complicated chapter in Abraham's story. Tension already existed inside the family: conflict, jealousy, pain. Eventually, according to the biblical narrative, Ishmael and Hagar were sent away. Imagine Isaac growing up inside that reality. Children notice more than adults think. Silence inside families, unspoken conflict, emotional tension, absence, questions no one fully answers. And perhaps those things matter, because Isaac's childhood was not emotionally simple. This was a family carrying promises, but also wounds, faith, but also fear, love, but also uncertainty. And perhaps Abraham himself carried emotional weight too. Think about what Abraham endured. Years of uncertainty, years of waiting, fear, migration, survival, hardship, delayed promises. Parents shaped by struggle often love deeply, but sometimes unknowingly pass anxiety to their children, not because they mean harm, but because wounds travel quietly, through behavior, through fear, through silence, through expectation, and perhaps that feels deeply familiar today. Many people inherit emotional burdens without realizing it. A parent's fear of failure, a parent's anxiety, a parent's emotional distance, a parent's unresolved pain. Love exists, but so do invisible scars. And perhaps Isaac understood that feeling more than we realize, because being Abraham's son meant living beneath extraordinary expectations. Imagine people around him. Whispers, stories, the child of promise, the miracle child, the chosen son, everyone expecting something significant, and perhaps that kind of identity feels heavy. Modern psychology has a phrase for this: the burden of expectation. Children often struggle when identity becomes too tied to performance, to purpose, to being special, because eventually, many children quietly wonder, what happens if I disappoint everyone? Am I loved for who I am? For what I represent? And Isaac represented everything: the covenant, the future, God's promise, the continuation of Abraham's story. Imagine growing up beneath that shadow. A father admired for extraordinary faith, a father respected, a father carrying spiritual significance. How difficult must it have felt to simply be yourself? Because children of extraordinary parents often carry invisible pressure. Modern people understand this too. The child of a successful parent, a famous family, a respected leader. High expectations quietly shape identity. Sometimes inspiring, sometimes overwhelming. And perhaps Isaac faced something similar. Still, the historical world Isaac lived in matters too. Life in the ancient Near East was difficult. Families traveled often. Conflict between tribes existed constantly. Food shortages happened. Survival required resilience. Children matured quickly. Responsibility arrived early. This was not modern childhood. No protected innocence. No emotional vocabulary. Fear was part of daily life. Trust mattered deeply. Family bonds meant survival, which makes what happened next feel even more complicated. Because, in ancient cultures, fathers represented safety, protection, authority, guidance. Children trusted parents with survival itself. Imagine that. Your father is your protector, the person keeping danger away, the person standing between you and fear. And then, one day, according to the story, that same father leads you up a mountain, brings wood, builds an altar, and something changes forever. But before we go there, we must pause. Because whether one reads Isaac's story, historically, psychologically, spiritually, something uncomfortable emerges. This was not simply a child. This was a child carrying enormous emotional weight long before the mountain appeared. Expectation, legacy, pressure, complicated family dynamics, a father wrestling with faith, a family shaped by uncertainty, and perhaps that matters, because trauma rarely begins in isolation. It forms inside context, inside relationships, inside expectations, inside silence. And maybe the deeper question is not only what happened on the mountain. Maybe the deeper question is, who was Isaac before the mountain? Because understanding the boy matters. The son, the child of promise, the child everyone believed was chosen, the child who trusted his father completely. Because soon, that trust would be tested in a way few stories dare to imagine. A journey would begin. A mountain would appear. And history would remember one terrifying question forever. What happens to a child when love and fear become impossible to separate? There are moments in history, or perhaps moments inside faith, that feel impossible to explain. Moments so uncomfortable, so emotionally heavy, that even thousands of years later, people still struggle to understand them. This is one of those moments. It begins quietly, like most life-changing moments do. No storm, no warning, no visible sign that something terrifying is about to happen. Only mourning and silence. The ancient story says Abraham woke early, earlier than usual perhaps, the kind of early that feels deliberate, heavy, uncomfortable. Imagine him standing in silence, preparing supplies, wood, fire, a knife, his hands moving automatically, while something inside him trembles. Because according to the story, Abraham already knew something Isaac did not. The command had come, a test, impossible, unthinkable. Take your son, your only son, the son you love, Isaac, and offer him. Imagine hearing those words, a father who waited decades for this child, a father who crossed deserts carrying impossible hope, a father who believed this son was the promise itself. And now, the impossible request, lose him, give him back. And perhaps that is where the story first becomes deeply human. Because faith sounds beautiful until it asks for something painful. Imagine Abraham that morning, standing beside a sleeping Isaac, watching him rest, perhaps remembering the years of waiting, the prayers, the impossible birth, the laughter, the joy, and now, the unbearable weight of what comes next. Did Abraham sleep the night before? Did he cry? Did he question? Did fear swallow him whole? The story does not say. It leaves silence. And sometimes, silence feels heavier than words. Still, morning came, and Abraham moved. Isaac walked beside him. Imagine the scene. Father and son traveling together, dust beneath tired feet. The world quiet. The kind of silence families know when something feels unspoken. 3 days. According to the story, they walked for 3 days. Think about that. 3 days carrying unbearable knowledge. 3 days saying nothing. 3 days looking at your son, while already knowing what might happen. Imagine how slow time must have felt. Every step heavy. Every conversation painful. Perhaps Isaac spoke casually. Ordinary things. Simple observations. The innocence of someone who still feels safe. Still trusts. Still believes his father will protect him. And perhaps that trust makes the story harder to bear. Because trust is sacred, especially between parent and child. Children believe, adults keep danger away. Parents represent safety, protection, comfort. And yet, according to the story, Abraham walked carrying something terrifying. The possibility that danger was walking beside Isaac the entire time. Eventually, they arrived near the mountain. The place Abraham had been shown. Imagine seeing it in the distance. Silent, still, unremarkable, perhaps. Yet somehow, everything changes there. The servants remained behind. Only father and son continued. And perhaps that matters, because now the story becomes deeply personal. No crowd, no witnesses, only them, only trust, only silence. Abraham placed wood on Isaac's shoulders, the son carrying the burden of sacrifice, without yet understanding what it meant. And somehow, that image feels painfully symbolic. Children often carry burdens they do not fully understand. Family, pain, parental expectations, unspoken fears, invisible wounds, and perhaps Isaac carried more than wood that day. He carried trust, innocence, love. Then came the question. One sentence, quiet, simple, heartbreaking. Isaac looked at his father and said, "Father," and Abraham answered, "Yes, my son." Then Isaac asked, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the offering?" Pause there for a moment. Imagine Abraham hearing those words, the trust in Isaac's voice, the innocence, the question he had dreaded. Perhaps that moment hurt more than anything. Because what do you say? How do you answer? How does a father explain something impossible? The ancient text says Abraham answered, "God will provide." Perhaps faith, perhaps desperation, perhaps hope that somehow this story would end differently. Still, they kept walking, together, father and son, towards something neither could fully escape. Eventually, they reached the top. The altar was built, stone arranged carefully, wood placed in order, everything prepared. And then, the moment history never forgot. Isaac understood. We are not told exactly how. Maybe Abraham explained. Maybe silence explained enough. Maybe fear suddenly appeared in Isaac's eyes. The text does not say, but somehow, the boy knew. Imagine that realization. The sacrifice was him. And perhaps this is where the story becomes deeply disturbing. Because historians, psychologists, parents, readers for centuries have asked the same question. Why did not Isaac run? By many interpretations, Isaac was not a small child, possibly strong enough to resist, strong enough to escape. Yet according to the story, he stayed. Was it obedience? Shock? Trust? Fear? Love? Perhaps all of them. And maybe that complexity feels painfully human, because children often remain loyal, even when confused, even when frightened, especially when trust runs deep. Abraham bound Isaac. Imagine the silence. No dramatic speech, no explanation capable of making sense, only hands trembling, only breathing growing heavier, only fear impossible to name. And then, the knife, raised, time slowing, the unbearable moment between action and consequence, and somewhere, Perhaps everything inside Abraham shattered. Everything inside Isaac, too. Then suddenly, a voice. Stop. The command ended. The test over. Shishak spared. A ram appeared. Sacrifice replaced. Life preserved. And perhaps that should feel like relief. The happy ending. The miracle. The rescue. Except something about the story still feels unresolved, because here is the uncomfortable truth. Near death changes people. Fear changes people. Trust, tested at its breaking point, changes people. And perhaps that is why many modern readers cannot stop asking, what happened to Isaac afterward? Did he ever feel safe again? Did he look at Abraham differently? Did silence settle between them? Did something invisible fracture? Or did Isaac somehow understand what no one else fully could? The story becomes strangely quiet afterward. Almost unsettlingly quiet. Shishak disappears for a while. Sarah dies soon after. Abraham continues. Yet many readers notice something strange. Father and son are rarely shown together again in the same way. Coincidence. Literary choice. Emotional distance. No one truly knows. And perhaps that uncertainty keeps the story haunting, because the mountain never fully disappears. Not emotionally, not psychologically, not spiritually. The mountain remains, a place where trust met terror, where faith met fear, where love became impossibly complicated. And maybe that is why Isaac's story still matters, because many people understand complicated love. Parents who meant well, but still caused pain. Families carrying silence. Children growing up confused. Love mixed with fear. Safety mixed with unpredictability. And perhaps that is what makes this story timeless. Not because of sacrifice, but because every generation eventually asks the same painful question. Can love survive fear? And maybe on that mountain, something inside Isaac learned an answer. The rest of his life would quietly carry. And now, we arrive at one of the most uncomfortable questions in Isaac's story. A question the Bible never directly answers. A question historians, theologians, psychologists, and ordinary readers still wrestle with. Did Isaac carry trauma for the rest of his life? Because, let us be honest, the story on the mountain feels difficult to ignore. A child, bound, placed upon an altar, watching his father raise a knife. Even if the sacrifice never happened, the fear did, the confusion did, the memory did, and perhaps that changes everything. For centuries, most religious discussions focused on Abraham, his faith, his obedience, his willingness to trust God. Shishak often became secondary. The silent son, the passive figure, the child standing quietly inside another man's spiritual story. But modern readers ask something different, a harder question, a more human question. What about Isaac? What did this experience do to him? Because today, we understand something ancient societies rarely discussed. Trauma shapes people, especially childhood trauma. Fear leaves marks, sometimes invisible ones. Experiences involving betrayal, loss of safety, emotional confusion can echo through an entire lifetime. And suddenly, Shishak's story feels psychologically unsettling, because if we read the story, past history, or even emotionally realistic storytelling, something important emerges. Shishak experienced something extraordinary, and perhaps something deeply frightening. Think about it. Children trust parents instinctively. Parents represent protection, safety, predictability, especially fathers in the ancient world. A father meant survival, guidance, authority, the person standing between you and danger. Now imagine the person you trust most becoming the source of fear itself. even briefly, even for one terrifying moment. Psychology today has language for this. Attachment disruption. When the person meant to protect you suddenly becomes frightening. Confusion enters deeply. Love and fear begin overlapping. Trust becomes complicated. And perhaps that possibility changes the way many people read Isaac forever. Because the Bible itself becomes strangely interesting after the mountain. Notice something subtle. Shishak changes, quietly, almost mysteriously. Unlike Abraham, Shishak becomes a surprisingly passive figure. Think about it. Abraham moves boldly, leads, travels, negotiates, acts decisively. Jacob schemes, fights, runs, transforms. Joseph rises dramatically through suffering. But Isaac, Shishak often feels quieter, more withdrawn, less active, less confrontational, almost emotionally restrained. Coincidence, personality, something deeper. Some psychologists and modern interpreters wonder, could Isaac's silence reflect emotional injury? Not proof, only possibility. But fascinating possibility, because trauma rarely announces itself dramatically. Sometimes, it changes behavior quietly. People become cautious, passive, emotionally distant, hypervigilant, fearful of conflict, more dependent, more withdrawn. And suddenly, certain details in Isaac's later life begin feeling strangely relevant. Consider this. After the mountain, the Bible never again records direct conversations between Abraham and Isaac in the same emotional way. That absence feels noticeable. Some scholars see nothing unusual. Others quietly wonder, did something change between them? Again, the text never says, but silence leaves room for questions. Then there is Sarah, Shishak's mother. The timing feels strange. Soon after the near sacrifice, Sarah dies. Some ancient Jewish traditions even speculate dramatically. What if Sarah learned what almost happened? What if grief overwhelmed her? No certainty exists, only speculation. Still, imagine Isaac emotionally. The mountain, fear, confusion. Then losing his mother. One emotional rupture after another. Could experiences like that shape someone? Modern psychology answers quickly. Of course. Then there is another fascinating detail. The Bible tells us Isaac loved Rebekah deeply, unusually deeply for the ancient world. After Sarah's death, Rebekah brought comfort. The text says Isaac found consolation after his mother's loss. That sentence matters, because grief appears quietly beneath the story. Loss appears, emotional need appears, and perhaps something inside Isaac still searched for safety, for grounding, for healing. Still, not everyone agrees with trauma interpretations. Many religious readers push back strongly. Their argument sounds something like this. Perhaps modern people impose psychology onto an ancient story. Perhaps Isaac was not traumatized. Perhaps Isaac trusted God completely. Perhaps he understood the spiritual meaning. Perhaps the event strengthened faith rather than damaged trust. And honestly, that perspective deserves respect too, because historical interpretation becomes difficult across thousands of years. Ancient people understood suffering differently. Faith shaped identity differently. Family structures differed. Children matured earlier. Cultural expectations changed emotional responses. We must remain careful not to force modern assumptions onto ancient lives too quickly. Still, there are uncomfortable questions impossible to ignore. Questions many readers quietly ask. If you were Isaac, what would you feel? Fear, confusion, relief, betrayal, trust, love, anger, all of them, because humans are complicated. especially children, especially inside painful experiences. And perhaps the deepest truth is this: people can deeply love parents while still carrying wounds from them. That feels painfully modern, because many people today understand complicated family love. Parents who sacrificed everything, yet still caused pain. Parents who meant well, yet left emotional scars. Parents loving deeply, while unknowingly passing fear forward. And maybe that is what makes Isaac suddenly feel so relevant. Because trauma rarely begins with evil. Often, it begins with pain traveling through generations. Think about Abraham himself, his entire life shaped by uncertainty, migration, fear, delayed promises, risk, testing, hardship. Could Abraham have unknowingly passed anxiety to Isaac? Modern psychology says yes. This concept even has a name: generational trauma. Pain inherited emotionally. Fear passed quietly. Patterns repeating. Parents transmitting wounds they never intended to give, sometimes through silence, sometimes through behavior, sometimes through expectations. And suddenly, Isaac's story stops feeling ancient again. Because how many families today carry inherited pain? Fear passed down, emotional distance repeated, anger repeated, anxiety repeated. Children carrying burdens never chosen. Perhaps Isaac became the first biblical picture of something deeply human, a son inheriting both blessing and emotional complexity. But there is another side to the story too. A hopeful side, because trauma does not always destroy people. Sometimes, people carry pain and still build lives, still love, still grow, still parent, still heal imperfectly. Isaac eventually became a father himself, a husband, a continuation of Abraham's story. Life continued, meaning continued, the covenant continued. Perhaps that alone says something beautiful. Because human beings are resilient. Wounds matter, but wounds are not always endings. And maybe that matters deeply for people listening today, because many people quietly ask, will what happened to me define me forever? Will my childhood always shape me? Can broken trust ever heal? Isaac's story offers no simple answer, only complexity. And perhaps that honesty matters, because healing is rarely simple. Trust is rarely simple. Family is rarely simple. Love itself is rarely simple. And maybe that is why Isaac continues haunting readers, because his silence feels familiar. His complexity feels familiar. His unanswered questions feel familiar. And perhaps that is what makes the controversy so powerful. Not merely, did Isaac have trauma, but something harder, something deeply personal. If love and fear become tangled inside childhood, what happens to the person we become? Because maybe the mountain never fully disappears. Maybe people spend years climbing down from experiences no one else fully understands. And perhaps Isaac spent the rest of his life carrying something invisible. Not only faith, not only blessing, but memory. The kind memory leaves behind. After a son almost died. Now, let us step away from Isaac for a moment. Forget the mountain. Forget the altar. Forget the ancient world. And ask a question that feels far more personal, and perhaps far more uncomfortable. Can family wounds be passed through generations? Because maybe that is why Isaac's story still feels haunting. Not because most people understand ancient sacrifice, not because everyone studies biblical history, but because deep down, many people understand something painfully familiar. Families shape us, even long after childhood ends. Sometimes beautifully, sometimes painfully, sometimes both at the same time. And perhaps that is where Isaac suddenly stops feeling ancient. Because if we are honest, many people already know what it feels like to inherit something invisible. Fear, silence, anger, pressure, anxiety, emotional distance, love mixed with pain. The strange feeling of carrying emotions that somehow feel older than yourself. And maybe that is what makes Isaac's story feel so modern. Because psychologists today talk about something called generational trauma. The idea that emotional wounds can quietly pass from one generation to the next. Not through intention. Not because parents are evil, but because pain rarely disappears on its own. It travels quietly. Through behavior, through habits, through fear, through what families say, and what families never talk about. Think about Abraham for a moment. His life was shaped by uncertainty. Leaving home, fear of survival, famine, delayed promises, risk, pressure, testing. Imagine carrying decades of anxiety, faith mixed with fear, responsibility mixed with uncertainty. Now imagine becoming a parent. Could some of that fear quietly shape the way you love your child? Of course, modern psychology says something deeply important. Unhealed pain often becomes inherited behavior. Parents do not pass down only eye color or personality traits. Sometimes, they pass down emotional survival strategies. Fear of abandonment, difficulty trusting, emotional withdrawal, perfectionism, hypervigilance, anger, silence, and perhaps many people listening already understand this. Maybe your parents loved you deeply, yet something still felt heavy. Unspoken tension, emotional distance, pressure to succeed, fear of disappointing others, love that somehow felt conditional, or perhaps parents who struggled to express emotion at all because maybe they never learned how themselves, and perhaps that is the painful truth about family wounds. Most pain begins long before us. A wounded parent often came from wounded parents. Fear repeats, silence repeats, control repeats, emotional absence repeats, until someone notices the pattern and asks, where did this begin? Think about Isaac again. A boy born into extraordinary expectation. A father carrying enormous pressure. A complicated family history. And then, the mountain and experience no child forgets. If Isaac carried emotional wounds, what happened next? He became a father. And something fascinating appears in the biblical story, because Isaac's own family becomes deeply fractured. Sibling rivalry, favoritism, emotional division. Jacob and Esau competing, parents choosing favorites, conflict shaping the next generation. And suddenly, something feels painfully familiar, because family pain rarely stays isolated. Sometimes, it echoes, again, and again, and again. Modern families understand this too. A father raised without affection struggles to express affection. A mother shaped by anxiety passes anxiety unknowingly. Parents carrying unresolved fear accidentally teach fear. Children adapt, then grow up, then repeat what once hurt them, without fully understanding why. And perhaps that realization feels uncomfortable, because many people quietly ask, am I becoming my parents? Sometimes that question feels beautiful, sometimes terrifying, and perhaps that is one reason Isaac matters, because his story quietly reminds us, family patterns are powerful, but not inevitable. That matters, because generational trauma is not destiny. It is influence, a starting point, not a prison. And modern psychology offers something hopeful. Patterns can change. Cycles can break. Healing can begin. But first, someone must become aware. Someone must stop and ask difficult questions. Why do I react this way? Why does conflict scare me? Why do I struggle to trust? What fear am I carrying that was never originally mine? Because awareness changes everything. Unexamined pain repeats. Examined pain begins healing. And perhaps that is the modern challenge Isaac quietly leaves us with. Not blame, understanding. Because blaming parents entirely is too simple. Most parents do the best they know how. Many love deeply, sacrifice deeply, try deeply, and still, sometimes wounds happen. Not because love was absent, but because human beings are imperfect. And honestly, that truth feels deeply human. Many people listening probably understand complicated love. Parents who cared, yet still caused hurt. Parents who sacrificed, yet still felt emotionally unavailable. Parents who meant well, yet somehow passed down fear. And perhaps that contradiction hurts, because children want simple stories. Good parent, bad parent, safe, unsafe. But real life rarely works that way. Love can exist beside pain. Care can exist beside misunderstanding. Families can be beautiful and complicated at the same time. And maybe Isaac's story understands that complexity better than we realize. Because Abraham loved Isaac, the story makes that clear. Yet something terrifying still happened. Love existed. Fear existed too. And perhaps many families today understand exactly what that feels like. Still, there is another uncomfortable modern parallel: expectations. Because some wounds are invisible. No violence, no obvious harm, only pressure. Pressure to succeed, pressure to be perfect, pressure to carry family dreams, pressure to become what others expect. Think about Isaac again, the miracle child, the chosen child, the promised child. Imagine growing up carrying expectations that large. And honestly, many people understand that burden. The successful family, the family business, the pressure to make parents proud, the feeling that love somehow depends on achievement. And eventually, many children quietly wonder, am I loved for who I am? For who people expect me to become? That question changes people. And maybe Isaac quietly wrestled with something similar. Still, before this becomes too heavy, there is something hopeful hidden here. Something deeply important, because perhaps the greatest lesson of family wounds is this: what was passed to you does not have to end with you. That matters. Pain may explain behavior, but it does not excuse staying trapped forever. Fear may arrive honestly, but healing remains possible. Patterns may feel powerful, but awareness creates choice. And perhaps that is where healing begins. When someone finally says, "This pain stops with me. This fear stops with me. This silence stops with me." Not perfectly, not overnight, but intentionally, slowly, humanly. Because healing rarely happens dramatically. Healing often begins quietly, through therapy, honest conversations, boundaries, forgiveness, awareness, courage, the willingness to finally face what earlier generations could not. And perhaps that is the real modern parallel hidden inside Isaac's story. Not merely trauma, but responsibility. The responsibility to notice what we inherited before we unknowingly pass it forward. Because perhaps every generation receives two things: blessing and wounds. And eventually, each person must decide, what will I continue? And what ends with me? Because maybe that is the question Isaac still quietly asks humanity. If pain can travel through generations, can healing travel too? And perhaps the answer depends on whether someone becomes brave enough to finally stop climbing the mountain, carrying wounds that were never theirs to keep. And so, after the mountain, after the silence, after the fear, after all the questions history never fully answered, we arrive at the end of Isaac's story. Or perhaps not the end. Because some stories never truly leave us. Some stories survive because they touch something too human to forget. And perhaps that is why Isaac still matters. Not because everyone agrees on what happened. Not because historians solved every mystery. But because somewhere deep inside, many people understand what it feels like to carry complicated love. Love mixed with fear. Protection mixed with pressure. Trust mixed with confusion. And maybe that is exactly what Isaac's story still warns humanity about. Because at its heart, Isaac's story is not only about sacrifice. Perhaps it is about relationships. Family, trust, fear. The invisible things children carry long after childhood ends. And perhaps that is where the first lesson begins. Lesson 1. Children remember more than adults realize. Children are always watching, always listening, always feeling, even when adults think they do not understand. The tone of voices, silence inside a home, fear between parents, pressure, emotional distance. Children notice, sometimes, more deeply than adults ever realize. And perhaps that matters deeply in Isaac's story. Because even if the mountain lasted only one terrifying moment, moments matter. Especially childhood moments. One frightening memory. One broken trust. One painful experience. Sometimes, those things quietly shape entire lives. Modern psychology understands this well. Childhood experiences do not disappear simply because time passes. They become part of identity, part of relationships, part of how people love, trust, fear, protect themselves. And perhaps many adults listening understand this already. Because sometimes we spend years untangling emotions that began in childhood. Fear of rejection, difficulty, trusting, perfectionism, anxiety, emotional distance. People often ask, why am I like this? And, sometimes, the answer quietly leads backward, toward old experiences, old wounds, old fears, toward mountains we climbed long ago. And maybe Isaac reminds us, be careful what moments children carry, because children remember emotionally, even when words disappear. But Isaac's story teaches something else too. Something deeply uncomfortable. Lesson 2. Love alone does not automatically prevent harm. This may be one of the hardest truths for parents to hear, because many parents deeply love their children. Truly, sacrificially, wholeheartedly. And still, sometimes pain happens. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but accidentally, through pressure. Fear, emotional absence, expectations, silence. Isaac's story feels complicated because Abraham clearly loved him. The Bible says so, yet something terrifying still happened. And perhaps many families understand this painful contradiction. A loving parent can still create fear. A caring parent can still pass anxiety. Good intentions do not automatically remove emotional consequences. And honestly, that realization hurts. Because many adults quietly wrestle with this question. My parents loved me, so why do some memories still hurt? And maybe the answer is not blame. Maybe the answer is complexity. Human beings are imperfect. Parents are imperfect. Love exists. Mistakes exist too. And perhaps maturity means learning to hold both truths at once. Someone can love you deeply and still wound you unintentionally. That truth feels painful, but also strangely freeing. because understanding complexity creates compassion. Not excuses, but understanding. And perhaps that understanding helps healing begin. But Isaac leaves another warning too. One perhaps even more important today. Lesson 3. Fear is easily passed down inside families. Fear spreads quietly, sometimes without words. A parent anxious about safety raises anxious children. A parent shaped by scarcity teaches fear of loss. A parent carrying emotional wounds sometimes unknowingly teaches emotional survival instead of emotional safety. Think about Abraham again, a man shaped by uncertainty. Years of waiting, testing, migration, fear, responsibility. Could some of that fear have shaped Isaac? Probably, because humans naturally pass forward what shaped them. And modern families still struggle with this every day. Fear of failure, fear of weakness, fear of emotions, fear of vulnerability, fear of disappointing others. Many people inherit emotional habits without realizing it. And perhaps the greatest danger is not fear itself. The greatest danger is unexamined fear. Because unexamined fear becomes inherited fear. And inherited fear quietly becomes identity. Unless someone notices, unless someone heals, unless someone says, "This pattern ends with me." And maybe that is one of Isaac's deepest warnings. Not simply, do not hurt children, but pay attention to what you unconsciously teach them. Because children often inherit what parents never intended to pass down. Still, Isaac teaches something hopeful too, something deeply human. Lesson 4. Pain does not have to define a life. If Isaac truly carried fear after the mountain, the story did not end there. He still loved, still married, still became a father, still continued life. And perhaps that matters deeply, because wounds matter. But wounds are not destiny. Trauma matters, but trauma is not identity. Pain shapes people, yet it does not fully decide who people become. And perhaps many people listening need that reminder. Because some people quietly believe, what happened to me ruined me. My childhood defined me. My fear will always control me. But human beings are remarkably resilient. Healing happens slowly, messily, imperfectly, but genuinely. And perhaps Isaac's silence reminds us of something important. People often survive more than others realize. Still, survival alone is not enough. Healing matters too. And perhaps that is where modern humanity still struggles. Because many people learn to survive without learning to heal. But Isaac leaves us with another uncomfortable lesson, one especially important for parents. Lesson 5. Children need safety more than perfection. Parents often pressure themselves endlessly, trying to become perfect, never failing, never making mistakes. But perhaps children do not need perfection most. Perhaps children need something simpler. Safety, emotional safety, consistency, trust, presence, the feeling that home remains safe, even when life becomes difficult. Because children build identity through safety. When children feel secure, they grow, explore, trust, become resilient. But when trust feels unstable, fear grows quietly. And perhaps that is one reason Isaac's story still feels so haunting. Because on that mountain, safety and fear became tangled together. And maybe that is exactly what modern parents should notice. Not perfection, presence, not flawless parenting, emotional awareness, not controlling children, helping children feel safe enough to become themselves. And finally, Isaac leaves us with perhaps the deepest lesson of all. Lesson 6. The way we love shapes generations. This may be Isaac's greatest warning. and greatest hope, because family patterns echo. Love echoes too. Fear spreads. Healing spreads. Silence spreads. Kindness spreads. Everything parents model travels farther than they realize. The way people speak, listen, apologize, handle conflict, show affection, respond to fear. Children absorb all of it, and one day, they pass some version forward. That truth feels heavy, but also beautiful, because it means healing matters, growth matters, awareness matters, not only for ourselves, but for generations after us. And perhaps that is why Isaac still matters. Not because we solved every mystery, not because we know exactly what happened inside his heart, but because his story quietly forces us to ask difficult questions about love, fear, trust, family, and the invisible things people carry. Because eventually, every parent, every child, every family must face the same uncomfortable truth. Love is powerful, but love without awareness can still wound. And now, after thousands of years, Isaac leaves us with one final question, a difficult one, a deeply personal one. What are we passing down without even realizing it? Fear, pressure, silence, unhealed pain, or something better, trust, safety, compassion, healing, because perhaps the greatest inheritance we leave behind is not money, not success, not reputation, but the emotional world we quietly build inside the people we love. And maybe that is the warning Isaac still whispers across generations. The wounds we refuse to heal often become the wounds someone else learns to carry.